Wow. War has a sound. It's not the roar of cannons nor the rattle of musket fire. It's the silence that follows when the screaming stops. In the summer of 1863, I learned that silence can be the loudest thing a man will ever hear. The July sun bore down on Pennsylvania with a merciless heat, the kind that made a man's shirt cling to his back before the morning dew had even lifted. Dust swirled around my boots as I walked the edge of the wheat field, my rifle heavy on my shoulder, my throat dry as parchment. They called it Gettysburg, a name that would come to weigh heavy in the hearts of Americans long after the smoke cleared. But that morning, to me, it was just another place where men would kill each other over a line drawn on a map and a belief carved into their souls. I was Corporal Elijah Booker of the 20th Maine. I'd been a farmhand before the war, strong in the back, quick with a plow, and slow to anger. But 2 years in uniform had turned my hands into callous tools for holding steel and spilling blood. We'd marched for days to reach this place, and when we finally stopped, I could smell it, the faint bitter tang of powder in the air. Somewhere beyond those rolling hills, men were already dying. Beside me trudged Private Samuel Crowder, a boy from Boston who had joined up only 6 months prior. His cheeks still had the softness of youth, though his eyes had already learned the hollow stare of a soldier. "You reckon this is where it ends, Elijah?" he asked quietly. I adjusted my canteen strap. "Ends? The war. Maybe this battle will decide it all." I didn't answer. War didn't work like that. Every man wanted to believe the next fight would be the last. But deep down, we knew the truth. Wars ended only when one side had no more men left to send. By midday, the heat became unbearable. Our regiment was ordered to hold a position along a rocky ridge called Little Round Top. The officers paced like caged hounds, scanning the tree line to the west. That's where the Confederates would come from, gray uniforms moving like shadows through the green. The first cannon shot cracked the stillness, echoing across the valley like the slam of a giant door. Within seconds, the air was alive with musket fire. The sound was deafening at first, but after a while, your mind learned to filter it out. You only noticed when it stopped. We formed a line along the ridge, bayonets fixed. I could feel the wooden stock of my Springfield rifle growing hot under the sun. Somewhere behind me, an officer barked orders I couldn't make out over the noise. Then, through the haze of powder smoke, I saw them, the Confederates. They came in waves, their flags whipping in the hot wind, their faces twisted in determination. The first volley hit our line hard. Men cried out, some clutching their stomachs, others falling without a sound. Samuel was shaking beside me, his knuckles white as he gripped his rifle. "Breathe," I told him. "Just breathe and aim." We fired, reloaded, fired again. The smell of burnt powder clung to my nostrils, mixing with the copper tang of blood. I watched a man in gray stagger forward with half his face gone, yet still holding his musket until he collapsed at our feet. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. My shoulder ached from the recoil, my throat screamed for water, and my mind had narrowed to a single thought. Hold the line. By late afternoon, our ammunition was running low. I could see the worry in the faces of the men around me. The Confederates were pressing harder now, their shouts growing louder, their lines closing in. Then came the order that would haunt me for years. "Fix bayonets!" The steel clicked into place, and a terrible stillness settled over us. For a brief moment, even the guns seemed to pause. My heart pounded in my chest as our captain raised his sword and shouted, "Charge!" We surged forward, a wall of blue and steel crashing into gray. I remember the clash of bayonets, the thud of bodies hitting the ground, the hot breath of a man I didn't know as I drove my blade into him. His eyes locked with mine for an instant before the life drained out. When it was over, I stood amid the bodies, my hands trembling, my uniform soaked in sweat and blood. Samuel was still alive, but his eyes were wide and glassy as if he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. Maybe he had. That night, as we lay among the wounded, I realized something. War wasn't about glory or honor. It was about surviving the next sunrise and finding a way to live with what you'd done to see it. The sun had barely broken the horizon when the first shots cracked through the air. They weren't warning shots. No one wasted bullets in Virginia anymore. These were meant to kill. I was crouched behind an old oak, its bark splintering from stray fire. The smell hit me first, that unmistakable stench of black powder mingled with the coppery scent of fresh blood. It clung to everything, my clothes, my skin, even my breath. The ground trembled as cannon fire roared from the ridge, shaking loose leaves that fluttered down like green snow. Men screamed in every direction. Some cried for their mothers, others cursed God outright. One young Confederate, no older than 16, stumbled toward me, clutching his side. He collapsed before I could even ask his name, his fingers still curled around a locket with a girl's picture inside. I took it from him, not as a trophy, but as a promise I knew I couldn't keep. I peeked around the oak. The Union line was holding, but barely. Blue-coated soldiers fired in disciplined volleys, smoke wrapping them like a ghostly shroud. I could see the fear in their eyes even from a distance, men pretending they weren't afraid of dying, when the truth was that every one of us was terrified. A shell burst not 50 yards from where I crouched, showering me with dirt and shredded branches. My ears rang, the world around me muted, as if I were underwater. Through the haze, I spotted Captain Rourke, his coat torn, his voice cutting through the chaos like a whip. "Hold the line! For God's sake, hold it!" We were outnumbered. We all knew it. But in that moment, with the smell of gunpowder choking my lungs and the ground shaking beneath my boots, the thought of retreat felt worse than death. Because if we ran now, this wasn't just about losing a battle, it was about losing the very idea of what we were fighting for. I gripped my rifle tighter, my knuckles white. Somewhere deep inside, I realized I'd crossed a line. I wasn't just a man trying to survive the war anymore. I was part of it. And war doesn't let go once it's claimed you. The morning of June 3rd, 1864, came with no birdsong. The horizon was a dull gray, and the fog sat low over the earth like a shroud. Cold Harbor had been quiet through the night, save for the distant thump of artillery. But everyone knew that silence was just the war catching its breath. Samuel and I crouched behind the breastworks, our rifles clutched tight, the damp air making the wood slick in our hands. He turned to me, his jaw set, his eyes carrying that same stubborn light they always had. "James," he said softly, "if I don't make it through today, you get this to her." He pressed the folded paper into my palm. His handwriting was messy, but I could see where the ink had smudged from his thumb. "Don't read it. Just promise me." I promised. God help me. I promised. The bugle call cut through the fog, sharp and merciless. Orders came down the line, and like cattle, we rose from the earth and moved forward into the open field. The Confederates were waiting. The first volley tore into us before we'd gone 20 yards. Men dropped all around, the wet earth swallowing them without ceremony. The smell of blood and black powder choked the air. Samuel was ahead of me, rifle raised, when the second volley came. I saw him stumble, saw the red bloom spread across his chest, and then he was down. I wanted to run to him, but the fire was relentless, a wall of death between us. The order to retreat came too late. By then, the field was already littered with more bodies than I could count. When night fell and the shooting ceased, I crawled out to find him. The letter was still in his coat pocket, dry and untouched. His eyes were open, staring at the stars. I closed them, but I couldn't close the ache in my chest. I never delivered that letter. War took Samuel, and it took my promise with him. Sometimes I wonder if the hardest part of war isn't the killing, it's the living with what's left behind.